BRICS 2023, the BRICS Summit just finally finished in Johannesburg, South Africa, and here are a few takeaways for you to take home to understand how things will unfold in the near future. We know now that there are 6 additional countries that will be added to officially to BRICS, taking it to BRICS Plus come January 1st. We have, first of all, Brazil has voted in and introduced Argentina to be accepted. We see South Africa and some other nations also introduce Egypt and Ethiopia to be introduced into the BRICS nations as well. Not only that, we see Saudi Arabia, UAE, United Arab Emirates, and Iran being introduced by Russia, and UAE, Saudi Arabia introduced by China to be inaugurated in January 1st into the BRICS Nation Plus. Now, this is a very interesting development because we know Saudi Arabia, Iran, and UAE are major oil producers, right? This brings the total for BRICS nations, Russia, Iran, Saudi Arabia, UAE. These 4 heavy hitter oil producing countries are about 42% of oil production on the planet. And we know oil is very efficient in order to produce energy, and energy consumption and production equates to civilization development. Russia, China, India are heavy hitters as well, and will continue to develop nuclear power plants as well. So this is great for civilization as well. So in this Johannesburg meeting, one thing South Africa's president, Cyril Ramaphosa, has been alluding to but has not taken place in this summit was the Goldback BRICS currency.
Let me start off by saying, President Lula, don't worry, when we have the BRICS meeting, the issue of currency is top on the agenda.
As I mentioned in my other videos, it's very complex to create a Goldback currency, and it takes a long time. It doesn't happen in 1 or 2, 3 years since you planned it, because there's a lot of moving parts, especially if there's going to be in total, as of January 1st, 2024, 11 members in total in BRICS Plus. It's going to be even more complicated to have a Goldback currency, but it's very interesting that the idea is seeded and it'll take a little bit of time to mature and develop, right? This is something that's going to still take a long time to unveil itself as a Goldback or commodity-backed currency. But if you do want exposure to this BRICS new currency, just buy gold. You know what I mean? Just buy gold bars or gold coins or even gold jewelry. That way you have exposure to the commodity, even if BRICS did not exist, right? If it did not exist, you should still have some precious metal exposure. I'm not your financial advisor, even though I am a financial advisor. I would say at least minimum, conservatively, like absolute minimum, you need to have is 5% of your total net worth be gold, right? Just as a hedge, just as an insurance policy to the fiat system that we have today. So in this BRICS summit, not only was the commodity-backed currency not discussed or hasn't really unveiled, we heard, hints from basically India saying that this isn't going to happen and all that jazz, right? We see that India is very close to the U.S. and the U.S., the last thing they want is anyone threatening their fiat system with commodity-backed currencies, because that's usually when empires start to flip. And that's usually the last phase of the flip, right? We also see that these nations, these 11 nations, have many things in common. We see that they are moving away from de-dollarization, not only increasing trade amongst one another, right, bilaterally or multilaterally, we also see them moving away from sanctions, right? The U.S. bond market, U.S. capital market is very deep. And so in order for sanctions to be effective, you need a deep and vast capital market. That way, when you're cut off, the majority of the world will also cut you off. So we see this slowly moving away, where the capital markets, the depth and the strength of the bond market of the U.S. is still very much a Goliath, right? But we see David with the BRICS nations coming up with, the slingshot and the rock, and starting to trade with one another, and eventually, the capitalization bond markets, eventually reserve markets, once they start dipping below 50, entering 40%, reserve assets will start to increase that are away from the U.S. hegemony and to other commodities and other national fiats and bond markets as well.
It's also possible to have more than one large reserve currency. There have been times when that was the case. It's also possible to have more than one large reserve currency. There have been times when that was the case.
So this is very interesting because we see that move away from U.S. exposure, thus limiting the amount of sanctions that the West and the U.S. can have on these nations, and they're increasing with one another with their own currency or with their own commodity-based resource trading as well. So this is very interesting. A lot of these countries also have that relationship, but a few of them are still, they're not really buddy-buddies. Like, for example, we have Ethiopia and Egypt right now. They have the Renaissance Dam, and there's a little bit of controversy there, right? Ethiopia wants to build a dam for their electricity, but Sudan and Egypt are involved as well because the mountain, the slope, descends from Ethiopia into Sudan down to lower levels of sea level into Egypt, going from the White and Blue Nile into the River Nile, right? And so this would limit the amount of water being put into Egypt and Sudan. And so Ethiopia is saying, hey, like, this will benefit the regions, and you guys, your own crews, will also not be affected too much. But we see that doesn't really happen because you have to fill up the reservoir of the dam. So there's a little bit of tension there amongst the BRICS plus nations. Not only that, we see, there's an agreement between China and India regarding their border disputes. There's a pact or like a relationship that's trying to be amended, but, land is a very sensitive issue, especially if you want to hold your land and prevent other people from encroaching on it or squatting on it. So India and China are putting up a good face, saying that, this is being resolved and stuff like that, but there's still some hostility and some tensions amongst one another. A lot of these BRICS plus nations have, interest in other countries or other states or other provinces or other land masses that the West does not really support, even though by face they'll say, yes, there's a one China policy, but here's Taiwan, and, the U.S. is invested heavily into the Taiwan Semiconductor Company, right? And so, what's going to happen there? You see the same thing with Russia and Ukraine, right? We see the USSR, once it was broken down, a lot of Russian USSR countries like Poland, Belgium, Belarus, Ukraine, Bulgaria, Mongolia have all been sort of separated, and now it's Russia, but Russia still, wants a lot of these countries to be second, like pretty much a community, like how Canada and the US are buddy-buddy. Same thing with a lot of these Russian-based or Slavic-based countries as well, right? So we have the same situation happening in India, where India wants to take quite a bit of Pakistan and, other regions around there as well. We see Ethiopia now saying, like, hey, like, not only about the Renaissance Dam, but they have some history as well with Eritrea. So it's very interesting how a lot of these countries are also not only economically strong with one another, but there's also land disputes amongst them. Make sure if you learned something now, please hit that like button. I appreciate it. Not only are these 11 countries come January 1st, 2024, going to be the new economic bloc, BRICS Plus, we also see that multilateral trade between their own resources, moving away from the dollar and starting to trade amongst one another with their own resources, going away from de-dollarization, moving away from the dollar, even though the dollar has a very deep bond market, a very deep capital market as well, the deepest on the planet, hence why sanctions are so effective, because they can cut them off from the SWIFT system, which has a very deep capital and bond market, as the reserves of the world move away from the U.S. and start to diversify naturally into commodities or other national markets as well, bond markets as well. We see that taking place, and this is also happening within the BRICS nations, where they are pulling back from U.S. bond structures, U.S. capital markets, and starting to trade with one another, invest in other countries' bond markets, away from the dollar, away from the U.S., into commodities like gold, like oil reserves. We're seeing the shift slowly taking place. All this does take a very long time to play out. It takes usually a decade to play out. By minimum, it could take longer. That's the same reason why we see BRICS Plus. Essentially, in 2024, they're not going to have a BRICS currency. There's no gold-backed currency or commodity-backed currency because it takes a long time. As in my other videos when I was mentioning this, that it does not just happen within 1 or 2 or 3 years. It takes a long time to have a structure, especially if you're increasing it from 5 to 11 countries. It's even more complex to have a gold-backed or commodity-backed currency. So I would not be surprised if they come up with something a little bit more similar to the IMF with the special drawing rights, where it's backed by certain countries' fiat. That would be a lot more easier to introduce. Well, as we know with organizations that have the plus on it, like in the EU, for example. It's very hard to basically come up with an understanding with an economy that is very fluid and not very rigid. You need a lot of people to agree when it comes to a lot of this stuff. So it's going to take a lot longer for this commodity-backed or gold-backed currency to come into play. But what's really happening with a lot of this is basically lending structures. The lending structures are pretty much there now with the introduction of Saudi Arabia, Iran, and UAE. That increases the large amount. Basically, in the BRICS Plus nations, we have 42% of oil production controlled by BRICS Plus members, right? So we have Russia, we have Iran, we have Saudi Arabia, we have the UAE, we have allies also of OPEC that are very much, buddy with these nations as well, like Venezuela. They don't like the U.S. Venezuela definitely does not like the EU because, they asked for the oil from England, and England said, nope, we're seizing it because, we're colonists and you're going to be a big though. We have better Navy and better Marines, we have better Army than you guys, so too bad, so sad. You should not have deposited your gold with us. You lost your gold, Venezuela. Suck it up. The way the West is acting is pretty much pushing away these countries towards the East, right? And so, with oil production being slowly over time going towards BRIC member nations, we see that this equates to civilization being developed. As we see civilizations do quite well, the more energy they spend. We see this industrial revolution happen with the US that gave us a huge leg up compared to the rest of the world because of the amount of oil, petroleum, situation that we had to burn and consume to create the world that we have today here in the US and in Canada. Countries that have a lot of oil tend to have a huge advantage. And we see that BRICS nations and producer nations will have that advantage as well. I want to thank you again for investing in yourself and your continued support here at the Financial Almanac, and I'll see you guys in this next video.